From the animation and atmosphere to the voice acting and music, everything about this episode was pretty much perfect. What is there then to talk about? Well, aside from some explanations for Rudy's peculiar behavior, there's the interesting details behind the way they fought the Hydra, Paul's own perspective on the way things turned out, and most importantly, the question of why. They're all valuable additions that make an already amazing episode better, so as I go through the best episode of Season 2 so far, here's how this epic fight with the Hydra went in the novels. Now, before I get into that, I know I've been talking about the Mugen apparel a lot lately, but we've just launched another new collection that I'm super excited to share with you. Since the demand for the Genesis T was crazy, we've launched 2 more alongside it for both Benimaru and Shion. They're once again subtle designs that I feel capture their essence, but aren't so out there that people will know it's anime. Those 3 are available to purchase right now, but if you're someone who wants all and bought the Genesis T already, you can email us here and we can arrange a potential discount or order change. The New Beginnings collection is still available too, so if you want Mushoku Tensei inspired apparel as well, you can check all that out with the link down in the description. We've got the goddess tees for each of the waifus and the New Beginnings set for that more subtle look. They're all screen printed on 100% cotton, so you can be sure the clothes are comfy and the designs won't fade. You can even get the goddess set as a trio of stickers if you want. Just head to mugenproject.com or follow us on Instagram for updates and giveaways. But anyway, episode 46, Parents, covering chapters 8 to 11 from volume 12 of the light novel. With the last teleporter being right in front of them, preparation was the most important thing right now. That meant taking stock of supplies, which in turn led Rudy to taking those advanced tier healing scrolls from Roxy. They were an emergency precaution just in case his throat or lungs got crushed like last time. He was also given a magically imbued crystal from Alina Lise, which was essentially a mana pot for if he or Roxy ran out. It wasn't something Rudy was particularly concerned with, but when exploring a labyrinth, magicians ran out of mana all the time, especially if the boss room was one of the arena types. This meant once you entered, you couldn't leave, so unless you were ready to slay the boss as is, it was always best to ensure you were as prepared as possible for it. Now, aside from the wonder of being face to face with a Hydra, what intrigued Rudy more was the condition of Zenith. It wasn't a worried panic like how we saw with Paul though, but rather a more confused how did she get there type look. His first thoughts weren't of concern or how do we save her, but instead a series of questions asking why. How was it that Zenith ended up inside this crystal, and why was it that she was all the way down here being guarded by this Hydra? It's an interesting perspective I'll get more into soon, but for now all you need to know is that this was what Rudy was thinking about. There were so many doubts behind the plausibility of all this happening by chance. It was before Rudy could express any of them though that Paul would charge in and Rudy be forced to engage. Since he wanted to end the fight in only one hit, what he charged up was a stone cannon on par with this one, a projectile strong enough to obliterate the body of the immortal Demon King. Unfortunately, it wasn't strong enough to pierce this Hydra's defenses, so as we saw in the anime, the only person capable of that was Paul. His movements were so fast that even Rudy's Eye of Foresight couldn't keep up, and his technique refined to the point that even if he didn't cut through a head in one slice, he would flip his body and use the centrifugal force from it to ensure he made the cut the second time. Both swords seemed perfect for the job, but to add a little context as to why this shorter one was better, it's because it was a magic item imbued with the highly rare steel cutting ability. This meant the harder the exterior of the opponent Paul was up against, the sharper his sword would become and the easier it would be to slice through. It was an amazing weapon that scaled in power proportionally to an enemy's durability. That also meant it was extremely dull when trying to cut softer things, but that's actually the reason why Paul was even able to secure it. You see, when a merchant was demoing it by trying to cut through dried meat, his inability to slice any of it made it seem like the blade was useless. Paul of course recognized it as that extremely rare steel cutting ability, so that was enough for him to step in and purchase it. It was a bargain buy he secured for literal pennies, making it an impressive find whose true value was shining now. Since the Hydra's scales were very clearly tough, That made Paul's sword the perfect tool against them. It's just that at this point there wasn't any strategy, and Paul's reckless behavior was putting his support in danger. The injury she received was actually a lot more sizable than what we saw in the anime, but nothing too severe that basic tier healing magic couldn't fix. From the way Rudy described it, it was a deep laceration that would have required dozens of stitches back in the old world. One that came just from a slight graze with the Hydra's razor-sharp exterior. That made it clear that getting close was dangerous, since if the lightest touch was enough to cut you open, those incapable of defending would be sliced to ribbons. It was an important concern that definitely needed to be discussed, but Paul clearly didn't even register it. His focus on Zenith closed out the fact Alinalise got hurt, and that didn't really sit too well with Rudy. I mean, yes, she was the party's tank, but just because taking damage was part of the job, that didn't mean that Paul should completely ignore her. It was a state of mind not beneficial to anyone. What bothered Rudy more than that, though, was once again that burning question of why. Reason being that there were quite a few things that just didn't make sense here. Like, even if you set aside the question of why Zenith got imprisoned here, how was it that she was teleported here to begin with, and how did Geese know that this was the condition she was stuck in? The former is a question that ties back to Rudy's research, and the latter refers to the peculiar wording Geese chose to use when describing Zenith. To focus on the former first, though, teleportation into a solid object wasn't something easily accomplished. Just like how you can't cast an offensive spell directly within a person's body, to transport a human into the earth itself was just as impossible. There was an insurmountable resistance between the mana at the destination and the mana in the person being teleported, one that made the two wholly incompatible with each other. That didn't mean that it was impossible though, since Rudy did speculate that with an obscene amount of mana, it probably could be done. So, as unlikely as it was for Zenith to be teleported right into this crystal, it wasn't impossible so long as enough mana was used. This makes me wonder whether Zenith was actually teleported here or not, since with her being the only case of teleportation like this, perhaps it wasn't the incident that had sent her here. Perhaps another factors at play and we're just getting looped in now. Either way, I'm sure it's something that'll be answered later. Now, as for how Geese knew that she was captured like this, well, it was this choice of wording that made him seem suspicious too. What I mean is that it implied he knew this was the state she was in without anyone ever coming here. An impossible scenario considering that no one has made it here. His story was that she was found by adventurers, but if that was true, then how did they get all the way here, make it back, and tell Geese about it? It's pretty obvious that they didn't, so something about the way Geese framed his information just wasn't adding up anymore. It was enough of a mystery that Rudy knew he needed to ask about it later. Unfortunately, we didn't get to see any of that in the anime, but that's the situation as is with all the smaller bits and details. To switch back to the problem at hand now though, the Hydra here wasn't one of the 3 confirmed living versions in the world right now. In the Demon Continent, there was the white, gray, and gold scale ones, but the one guarding Zenith had green scales. It was a fabled monster whose last recorded presence was during the Second Great Human-Demon War. A period of time from over 5,000 years ago. Legends say they were annihilated when the continent was split, but clearly that wasn't true given the one standing right in front of them. So this was a monster Rudy knew him and his party were very much outmatched by. So much so that he actually felt it was best to retreat and create a more specialized party. It was unlikely they'd find anyone whose specialty was the Hydra, but if there was at least one other person who could slice cleanly through the Hydra's neck, that alone would have made the fight significantly easier. It's just too bad that Rudy knew Paul wouldn't allow it. Given the state he was currently in, even if Rudy did leave and took everyone else with him, he knew Paul would have stayed behind and fought the Hydra solo. That's just how committed he was to ending this problem now. So, before we get more into how they're going to handle it, for a bit more context on Rudy's impartial behavior towards Zenith, a large part of it was actually because he'd already given up on her. That's a bit more blunt than how the novel put it, but what Rudy was expecting was literally nothing. He knew the odds of her surviving were minimal to begin with, so in the years she'd been gone, he'd prepared himself for the worst. Like, he didn't expect to find any trace of her, let alone her body. It's how I assume he was able to calmly question whether she was alive or not. This obviously wasn't appropriate given who she was to him, but as we saw in the anime, Zenith was less his mother and more just this person he happened to live with. A likely product of how he perceived interpersonal relationships at the time. Now, the most important thing prior to going back in was determining a formation and setting everyone's roles in it. Reason being that, with Paul being the only one capable of beheading and Rudy being the only one capable of cauterizing, ensuring both could do their jobs uninterrupted was absolutely essential. This meant Alina Lise and Tallhand would have to be decoys and Roxy would need to stay at the back and act as their healer. The result was an arrangement known as the Imperial Cross Formation. In the anime it wasn't so prominent, but as you'll soon see, it's actually a major part in how they were able to defeat the Hydra. They were significantly more organized than how they looked here. To finish off this conversation first though, Paul's statement to Rudy wasn't at all as cruel as you might think it was. As absurd as it is to hear your own parents say to fight to the death, the message being sent wasn't so much the literal words of what he was saying, but rather the genuine conviction behind it. What I mean is that by Paul saying what he did, he was displaying in full the trust he had for Rudy. Since his own determination would have him save Zenith at the cost of his own life, the fact he expected the same from Rudy meant he was thinking of him as an equal here. He was seeing Rudy for the adult he was and showing he believed in him just as much as he believed in himself. A message intent on getting Rudy to share the same determination as his own. He didn't actually want Rudy to die, since to save Zenith and lose Rudy in the process was, in his own words, completely nonsensical. Paul genuinely wanted to save everyone. He just needed Rudy to see how much he respected him first. Now, the anime portrayed the fight amazingly in its own way, but that Imperial Cross Formation wasn't something you'd know they were actively doing. So, it was Paul in front, handling one head at a time, Alina Lise and Tallhand on either side serving as both decoys and defense, Rudy right behind Paul so he could cauterize immediately, then Roxy behind him to provide heals for everyone. It was an optimized formation that took advantage of the Hydra's attack patterns. Since it typically only attacked with 3 heads at a time, this meant Alina Lise and Tallhand could parry one each, then that left the other for Paul and Rudy to handle all on their own. Occasionally it would swing a 4th head just to switch things up, but whether at Alina Lise or Tallhand, 2 heads at once weren't enough to overcome either of them. Even if either did get injured by a mistimed parry, Roxy would just run up, heal them, then return back to her position. They were a well-oiled machine, both highly methodical and organized, one whose sole purpose was to ensure that Rudy was protected. This allowed him to focus only on burning, and while the trust required to do so was immense, by the 3rd head, Rudy knew focusing on anything else was unnecessary. Alina Lise and Tallhand had proven he had nothing to worry about. Any head that got even remotely close was immediately deflected and quickly decapitated. So for a while this strict regiment was working spectacularly. It was when the group got the Hydra to 5 heads left though that once again it would switch things up. It had decided to attack with all 5 heads at once now, a focused charge directed straight towards Tallhand. He was able to dodge 2 and block another, but by the time the 4th came to attack 2, there was nothing Tallhand could do to defend himself anymore. He was immediately grabbed just like how we saw in the anime, then about to be split in half by the incoming 5th head. Luckily, Paul was there to save him, but that was the real reason why Tallhand got grabbed like that. I assume it's because the Hydra identified him as the weakest. Fast forward now to the Hydra's trump card, and this was an attack known as Dragon's Breath, an ability strong enough to melt steel and evaporate a bog, yet one not so powerful as to get the best of Rudy. What Rudy had done with his magic here, he suspected would have taken the equivalent of 10 magicians or more. There were no ordinary magicians that could have defended the Hydra's attack like this. Rudy, as we know, wasn't ordinary though, but had the Hydra waited and used each head's Dragon Breath one after the other, a longer consecutive shot might have been more of a struggle for him. Rudy didn't understand why it didn't, but what he did know was that once they were done, they couldn't use it again. It wasn't possible for the same head to fire Dragon's Breath in quick succession like that. So it was after this that Rudy would start to think that they'd won, but right as he was cauterizing the second to last head, once again the Hydra would do something different. It would flail its severed heads as if they were whips, a last-ditch move that was clearly the result of being driven into a corner. Rudy's eye of foresight made it clear that this was what was coming, but because he was so close to the Hydra's body, he couldn't understand what exactly it was doing. He was unable to comprehend the spiked weapons of destruction flying straight towards him. Paul, on the other hand, knew this was exactly what was coming, so he was completely focused while Rudy was not. In fact, he was so confident in the experience of everyone around him that he completely forgot Rudy was still a rookie in the labyrinth. Whereas him, Talhand, and Alina Lise knew to avoid this one last attack, Rudy simply didn't, and that's how he was caught. It was a lack of experience that unfortunately proved to be fatal. That's when Rudy would finish the job with Stone Cannon, but not without costing him his arm first. You see, since the Hydra's scales covered its eyelids too, just the act of blinking sliced straight through him. The rest was the Hydra's muscles snapping his bone apart. It was once Rudy came to his senses after this that his playback of what happened revealed why Paul got hit. Long story short, it was essentially a matter of Paul being too skilled. You see, a kick this strong would have sent any normal person reeling back from the recoil. Because Paul was someone who could fight with battle aura though, the recoil, which should have moved his own body out of the way too, was no longer present and instead kept him stationary. It had made it so where Rudy was before was exactly where he ended up. Now, as for what Paul thought about all this, his only thought was to save Rudy. The moment he saw Rudy was in trouble, his reaction was immediate and without any thought for what came next. The rest was him taking in the aftermath, but right as he would try and ask for healing too, his inability to do so combined with the looks on everyone's faces revealed the somber fact that he was dying. Now, here's where I'd usually go over what his last thoughts were too, but the CD drama does such a great job conveying them that I'm just gonna go ahead and play that instead. It'll also serve as the end of the video, so if you enjoyed what you saw and want to see more, be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. But now, try not to cry too much.
俺は死ぬのか。せめてゼニスが生きてるかどうかだけでも確認したかったな。それだけじゃねえ。ノルンやアイシャにもまた会いたかった。学校通ってんだっけか。大きくなったかな。リーレはどんな顔すっかな。迷惑ばっかかけたけど泣いてくれっかな。畜生未練だらけだ。死にたくねえ。まだやりたいことたくさんあるのによ。父さん。でもまあいっか。ルディが死ぬよりはよ。元